Jordan Grumet, a very, very warm welcome from the other side of the pond to the Humans versus Retirement podcast.
Dan, so glad to be here, and I'm going to try to be on the humans and retirement side, both of them.
Yeah, perfect. Well, that's what we want to talk about, right? I mean, that's the point of this, is to kind of say it's neither one or the other. They both intertwine with each other, and let's crack on. And I couldn't wish, I think, for, and all the guests have been wonderful, but I especially looking forward to this conversation. I first come across you and your work through Christine Benz and her book, and I couldn't put your chapter down. And I think your chapter had so much underlines and dog ears, and I was just thinking I've got to kind of reach out to Jordan and have a conversation with him. And you were gracious enough to send me a copy of your book that isn't even out yet. And I cannot wait to get into this conversation about purpose and how you believe that is the key ingredient to living a life well lived, and how that can go into, obviously, our retirement. But first, your story and journey is really interesting, Jordan. I think it sets it up beautifully for the work that you now do. I'd love for you just to share with us kind of how you ended up where you are today, and you wrote the book and all the things that you've done.
Well, it all started when I was 7 years old. My father was 40, and he was an oncologist, a cancer doctor, and he went to work one morning, and he was rounding in the hospital. He got a severe headache, and he collapsed and died. He basically had an aneurysm in his brain. That's a blood vessel that bursts. And as a 7-year-old, I saw the world through a very selfish lens. I thought everything happened because of me. So when my dad died, I figured I was either not enough, or I was a bad kid, or something was wrong with me. And eventually I figured the way I was going to cosmically fix this horrible thing that happened to me is I was going to become a doctor like him, walk in his footsteps, help all these people, and that would fix this horrible thing that happened to me. And that's exactly what I did. I decided I was going to become a physician. I had a learning disability at the time. I overcame that. And being a physician was my purpose and identity for much of childhood and a lot of early adulthood. And I went to medical school and I started practicing, but the problem was it wasn't filling me up the way I thought it would. I realized that while I like being a doctor, there was a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of paperwork, and I started to burn out. Now, when that happened, the only answer for me that I could figure out is I got to find a way out. And I had no idea the way out. So I asked my financial advisor, I said, how much money do I need in order to leave work? And they did all sorts of calculations, and the number was just outrageous. So I asked my accountant, who, by the way, was my mom at the time. And she said, oh, you need $10 million. I said, well, I don't have $10 million. So I was working along, burned out. And then this guy, Jim Dolly, the white coat investor, sent me his book. I was writing a medical blog at the time. He sent me his book to review from my medical blog, and it was all about physician finances. And I read his book, and it gave me this vocabulary on financial independence, and it actually helped me understand how much money I needed to leave this job that was no longer serving me. And I had an epiphany. My parents had modeled such good financial behavior. I was invested in the stock market. I owned real estate. I did all sorts of great things because they did great things. I was actually financially independent. And so I knew immediately after reading that book, I could leave medicine, this thing that was burning me out. But the problem was, it was the only purpose and identity I had ever known. So I actually had a panic attack. I was like, what the heck am I going to do with my life? I wasn't going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If I stepped away from medicine, I had no idea what I was going to do. So instead, over years, and it really did take me years, I started subtracting out all I didn't like about my job. So I got rid of owning my own clinic. Then I got rid of nights and weekends. I was working in the nursing home. That was stressful. So I got rid of that. After doing this for years, there was only one piece of medicine that I wanted to hold on to, one thing that I would do even if I wasn't being paid for it, and that was hospice and palliative care, taking care of the terminally ill, something that started almost as a side hustle. Early in my career, I was a medical director for one. I was working maybe 10, 15 hours. So I got rid of everything else, and that's what I was left with, was working 10 hours a week as a hospice medical director. This obviously freed up my schedule. I had plenty of time that I had never had before. And I started exploring these things that were always important to me, but I always thought they were hobbies. And so I never gave myself permission to really explore them. So I'd always loved writing. In fact, I'd written blogs since about 2003, 2004, but I did it on nights and weekends and when the kids were sleeping or during lunchtime when I had an extra moment. And so now that I had this free time, I started exploring these things. And because personal finance had shown me the way when it came to my finances. I started blogging about personal finance. Eventually that turned into a podcast about personal finance. And here was the thing. On my podcast, I was interviewing these world-renowned experts, these authors, these financial independence people, these 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs. And they could tell me all about how to accumulate wealth, but a lot of times they couldn't tell me what enough looked like. They couldn't tell me why they were accumulating so much wealth. And strangely enough, the answers to those questions came from an unexpected place. It actually came from my hospice patients. Because when I would go to the bedside and work with my hospice patients, they'd talk about things they regretted. They regretted they never had the energy, courage, or time to do and fill in the blank. Whatever that was, it was different for each person. But they never gave themselves permission to be the person they really wanted to be. And this was an answer that I thought I really needed to bring to my personal finance people. So I wrote a book called Taking Stock, and it was all about what the dying can teach us about money and life. And it was based on a number of premises, but the first and foremost was that we need to take purpose, identity, and connections and put that before our financial framework. So a lot of times we do the exact opposite. We build our finances, and then only after do we start thinking about purpose. So I was like, we need to put purpose first. And I went out to market this book, and I went to conferences, and I gave all sorts of talks. And something really unexpected happened. After some of my talks, people would come up to me, and instead of being excited, they'd be enraged. And the first time this happened, I thought it was a one-off, and I'm like, okay, that's no big deal, but it kept on happening. And the reason they were enraged is they'd look at me and they'd say, stop telling me to find my purpose. I've been looking for my purpose forever. I don't know what it is. It's causing me anxiety. Will people like you please stop telling me find your purpose? Now, of course, this enthralled me. I was like, wait a second, what's going on here? So I did a deep dive of the literature, and I found 2 facts that really contradicted each other. The first is studies clearly show, and I'm talking about tons of studies, clearly show that having a sense of purpose in life is associated with health, happiness, and longevity. Very, very clearly, tons of studies. On the other hand, I found other studies that up to 91% of people at some point in their life have something called purpose anxiety. This idea that the finding purpose causes them stress, frustration, depression, etc., kind of like I felt when I decided I wanted to leave medicine. And so this was a paradox. So the question is, how can purpose be the most important thing and be so stress and anxiety provoking? And what I realized through all my experiences, through being a hospice doctor, through coaching and masterminding and writing books about money and life, is that likely we get purpose wrong. We think of it as one thing, but it's actually probably 2 things. One of those is associated with all that stress and anxiety, the bad kind. And then there's a good kind, which is associated with the health, happiness, and longevity. And I realized that most of us don't see purpose this way. And so I wrote the book, The Purpose Code, to really make it clear, not to make purpose something ephemeral or pie in the sky or something we can't reach, but make it something very tactile that we all can practice every day.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
I've got that tangled around my chair. We'll edit that bit. I'll go straight in.
I hope so.
Oh my God, that was kind of, wow.
Did you get most of my answer though?
No, I got it all. No, it's fantastic. Good. I got all my lead was tangled around my chair and I couldn't move my head. I don't know, I didn't even do nothing. Sorry. Let's go in. We'll go in now. So, Jordan, I think, look, that's your experiences through your life and how you have, I think, worked both in, as you said at the start, the human side of this, understanding what kind of triggers and motivates humans. And it isn't spreadsheets and charts and, that's not what this is about. And I've come up with a 5-part framework for retirement, and it kind of goes in order, right? So when we think about retirement, it's purpose, identity, social connections, concept of time, and then money. So it kind of, if you kind of work through that framework, which is kind of what you said, I think a lot of people, as you rightly said, flip it round. It's, let's think about the money first, and the money will give me purpose, and the money will give me identity, and the money will buy me time. And that's not how we work and how we're wired. We're absolutely on the same page. I'm really interested. Obviously, you mentioned the book, which is when's release date, Jordan? But for the Purpose
January
Code?
7th.
January 7th. So whether this podcast goes out before or after, it will be around that time, and people listening will be able to get the book, and the link will be in the show notes. But the Purpose Code is a wonderful title, I think, to this book. And one of the things that I took out around this is around the big P purposes and little p purposes. And I think you just started touching on that when it comes to this anxiety driven thing that people have about purpose. So I'd love to, two things really. Why do you think, particularly in retirement, and I think purpose is essential throughout life, but why do you think purpose in retirement is probably more essential than at any point during our life? And can we go through the concept of the big P purpose and the little p purpose? Because I think that can really help people reduce their anxieties and how these kind of small intentional actions can drive our happiness and fulfillment.
So let's talk about big P and little p purpose first, and then let's talk about why purpose is important in retirement. So big P purpose is the one that I think is bad, that's associated with anxiety. And here in America, we always say, if you can think it, you can build it. And that's what big P purpose is. It's big, it's audacious, it's overwhelming. Think of becoming a billionaire or curing cancer or running to be president. These are huge goal-oriented versions of purpose. The problem is they're very difficult to achieve. You have to be the right person at the right time, saying the right things with the right genetics and a whole lot of luck. And the problem is most of us don't have agency to actually achieve those things. So it leads to frustration because they're all or nothing. You either succeed or you fail, and it's usually winner takes all, right? Only one person can be president. We saw that in this presidential election. Everyone else loses. Because of these facts and because it's so goal-oriented, it tends to be scarcity mindset oriented. Let's look at the other side. Little p purpose doesn't focus on goals, it focuses on process. So this is the idea of finding things you love the process of doing and doing as many as possible. Instead of all or nothing, it's all or all. It's pretty hard to fail just going out and finding things you love. Because of that, it is very abundance mindset oriented. We have tons of agency over it. We can control whether we achieve these things or not. So let's talk about purpose in retirement. Purpose is always important, but people have stress and anxiety about purpose in retirement, mostly for the simple reason that society sells us a vision of purpose that's big P purpose. So if we think about social media, if we think about marketing, we are being fed these images of six-pack abs, wearing the nicest clothes, traveling the world, and running 8-figure businesses. This is all very much big P purpose. Most people can't do this kind of stuff. But these influencers and these marketers are trying to sell us something. So they want us to co-opt this version of purpose so that we buy something. But it's not only social media and marketing. Our family and friends and society also tell us we should concentrate on certain professions and we should get certain jobs and we should be very job and goal oriented. So here's the thing. A lot of us spend our whole lives chasing these visions and especially chasing a job because it fills some version of big P purpose, some very big goal oriented version of purpose. If I am working in corporate America, I can always become a partner. I can always start my own business. I can do all these big audacious things. But here's the problem. When you step away from work and say, I'm done with that, that often is the only version of purpose people have ever set their sights on. And it's big, audacious purpose. And all of a sudden you're walking away from it. And that really leaves a vacuum. And so when people retire and they give up on this idea that my purpose in life is going to be working and this job that I've been striving at for all these years, that vacuum is empty and they don't know what to fill it with. And that leaves people just feeling lost. But I would argue that purpose is important throughout life. We just might feel it more acutely, especially in today's society once we retire.
Jordan, a quick thought on that. And this is more of an observation than anything baked in kind of scientific research, but just from the real humans that I've worked with and the real humans that you've worked with, and taking this off balance sheet, do you think that we are somewhat kind of spoon-fed our purpose through our career, i.e. we haven't really had to go and intentionally have purpose because it's just fallen on our lap a little bit, and it's kind of like you get on that treadmill of life and work, and what feels like big purposes or even any purposes is not something we've necessarily intentionally done. It's fell into it. So does that make that transition in retirement even harder, right? Because it's now probably potentially the first time since we might have been in our very late teens to kind of figure out what we're going to do. We're now being asked, well, actually, now you've got to come up with the answers yourself, and you've never really had to do this before. And it's all, is that true to you, do you think?
So what you're talking about is the difference between finding purpose and creating it. Most people think you find purpose. And how do you find purpose? Well, you look at social media, you listen to your family, your friends, you pay attention to media and advertising. They give you all these options of what purpose could look like in your life. And then you choose one and you co-opt it, and that becomes your sense of purpose. Here's the problem. We don't necessarily find purpose. We actually have to build and create purpose. And so the question becomes, what do you build and create purpose around? And what I call those are purpose anchors, which are inklings or beckonings, things that light you up. The problem is most of us build a life of purpose not on what lights us up and not what excites us, but what society has sold to us as important. And that's why there's such a feeling of loss when you leave that job. And all of a sudden someone's like, oh no, you don't find purpose. You don't choose it out from these different versions that everyone else is showing you. You actually have to build and create a life of purpose. And we're not used to doing that. And in fact, it's why purpose feels so hard to understand. Most people feel like you're just sitting there waiting and some version of purpose falls on your head. And if it's the right version, and if you grab it, then you're going to live a happy life. And if you don't grab it or you miss it or it never falls on your head, then you are lost and that's it. What most people don't identify is actually it's the other way around. I don't care what your purpose anchor is, and it's not even that important. It's just something that you feel, hey, that could excite me. What's really important is then the work you do around that. It's the building and creating, which is really going to identify how fulfilled you feel. And most importantly, it's the building and creating that's going to connect you to other people. Because I say this very clearly in the book. We talk about purpose and happiness, but I don't even think it's purpose that necessarily causes happiness, despite what all these studies show. I think purpose is a great conduit to people. I think through a sense of little p purpose, we actually create communities and connections, and that's where the happiness lies. And there's some great studies that talk about this. And so that's what we have to do. We have to build these communities around us, around little p purpose. And I think it's just very off-putting for someone who's always been trying to find it either through society or from somewhere else to actually have to start creating it.
I was going to say, let's go back to that, but let's not. Let's stay on that because I've got one question, actually. And this comes up a lot, the difference between men and women. Do you think that women are better at kind of creating a community of like-minded people and than men? Is that because I think that some of the feedback that I get is that a lot of the social connections that men have is dominated by their career. That, you know, the vast majority of them are surface level social connections. You know, they're not necessarily deep social connections. And actually having a united purpose of work is not particularly great in that, I don't think, right? So it seems to me that women, just because of, and again, this is maybe stereotyping a little bit, but just because they are potentially more homemakers, they're more social, there's more, you know, there's different areas. Is that something that happens, or is it equally as challenging?
I feel that's a cop-out. And here's why it's a cop-out. We think that you have this social gene, and so women have a better social gene than men, so they're much more likely to form relationships, etc. I think it misses the point. The point is not to go out and to try to make connections. The point is to find for you, and I say find, but which really is identify your purpose anchors and build a life of purpose around little p purpose. When you do that, you naturally attract people. It's not something you try to do. You do things that light you up, and like a moth to the flame, people are attracted to you. They want to collaborate with you. If they have something to teach you, they want to be your teacher. If they have something to learn from you, they want to be your student. They want to be mentor and mentee. This is how we do it. So instead of going out and saying, community and connections is important, so I'm going to join all these groups and all these communities, I say do the opposite. Find what lights you up. Find what makes you your best self. And when you do that, you're going to naturally form communities and connections. I'll also say women more than men tend to identify people as their purpose, and specifically their kids as their purpose. So that naturally brings a sense of community. The problem with that is once the kids get older, a lot of times you lose that community because the bonds between you are your children, not some deeper version of something that's important to you. So once the kids are gone, there's nothing that binds you to that community anymore, and it generally falls apart, or it's not a very strong community because it's not based on similar values or similar loves or joys. It's based on circumstances.
Yeah. And Sorry, go.
I would just say this. When it comes to identities, there are really two big kinds. There's communities of identity, and then there's communities of internal purpose. Communities of identity are based on things you don't control. Like, I live in a certain school district, so I'm part of that school district community. I live in a certain state, so I'm part of that community. I'm part of Generation X, so I'm part of that community. Those are identity communities. Those don't tend to be as strong as communities of internal purpose, which are communities of people who care deeply about something and then engage in it. So I'm part of the personal finance community and the podcasting community. That's a community of internal purpose. It's not an identity community. It's a community of what I call little p purpose. I do things that light me up, and that naturally connects me to other people who do the same.
So much to talk about there. I'm going to try, and I made a couple of notes. I'm going to try and remember what I want to say. So I think the empty nesting thing is interesting. There's loads of books being written about that. My two daughters are 16 and 13, and my wife's starting to feel a lot about that. Kind of actually, what does life look like after being mum? And that's a big challenge for her. So that just to kind of, I'm talking to her about this stuff at the moment. And also what I really love, what you said there, Jordan, was I think, and you rightly challenged me back, and I fully buy what you said. Isn't it this kind of, the more that we force ourselves into something, the less meaning it might have, right? I mean, it's that kind of, oh, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and join the golf club because I think that's going to, and actually I might not like playing, I mean, I love playing golf, but I might not like playing golf, and I might not get a sense of joy and all of that, right?
And that's big P purpose, right?
Yeah.
Because you just described big P purpose. I'm going to join the golf club, not because I love golf, not because I love the process, not because it's little P purpose. I'm going to join the golf club with this very specific big goal of finding happiness through community and meeting people. But the problem is that's a very goal-centered version of purpose, and you have so little agency over that. And what happens if that works? So you go play golf, you don't really love playing golf, and you spend 90% of your time playing golf you don't like, to maybe 10% of the time make a few extra friends and meet that goal. You're spending a lot of time doing stuff you don't like in service of these bigger goals. I'd say find stuff you love. And if you start doing that, you're going to naturally attract a community around you. And that community is going to be much stronger because it's going to be a community of people who actually dig the same things you do. I also wanted to make another point, and you were talking about your wife, and I think this is really, really important. A lot of people think their kids are their purpose, and as the kids get older, they do have this crisis because like, the kids are going to leave, and what am I going to do? Here's what I argue. I think it's really important to invest in your kids, and I think kids can be part of your purpose. But I think it's really, really important for your kids to see you engaging in little P purpose because you want to give them permission to do the same exact thing. We don't want our kids to model our behavior and live for their children. We want them to live for things that light them up and give them joy because God knows, maybe they won't find a spouse. Maybe genetically they can't have children. Maybe the world will change in such a way that people aren't having kids anymore. We don't know. But if we hand down to them this version of purpose is I take care of my children, I don't know if we're fully serving them. We want them to see us lit up doing things that we totally love because we want them to do the same exact thing when they get older.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think just anecdotally, when I think about our life, I mean, my wife's a hairdresser. I'm her worst client because I've got no hair. But she loves that, and she's been doing it since she left school, and it lights her up. And so, although her life isn't wrapped around the kids because she does a lot of home-based hairdressing and out, and so I think the kids respect that a bit more as well, right? They're seeing mum and dad going out and doing the stuff, and they're a little bit more independent on it and all that. So I think it's really interesting that you bring that up. And just a quick observation I do want to make is that it's starting to, I love having these conversations because I learn loads, and it's starting to make sense about some of these things. I think, one thing that I'm thinking about now and observing and thinking back from clients I'm working with at the moment is I think they're often replacing how can we call it, the framework of purpose they've had at work, and just kind of taking that framework and moving it into kind of retirement, right? The bit like we said, it's kind of like, well, I've got this kind of big goal orientated purposes that don't really light me up or fulfill me, but it's the only thing I know. So the easiest thing is to go and kind of replicate that purpose framework and go and join the golf club and do the thing. And it's so much more core and foundational than that.
I think people do that. because they're trying to prove their version of enough or their worthiness. And so I talk a lot in the book about the difference between meaning and purpose. And so in my estimation, happiness is meaning and purpose. It's both of them together. You need both. A lot of people think meaning and purpose are the same thing. But what I say is meaning is actually our cognitive understanding of our past. It's how we think about our past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Happy people tend to tell themselves a heroic story in which they had trauma, pain, difficulty, especially when they were younger, but they got through it. And that's why they are where they are today. And so they figure in the present and future, they're going to continue to get through it. It's a journey of enough. And so having a good sense of meaning and feeling like the hero, what you're really saying is I was enough back then and I'll be enough in the future. Unhappy people tend to not see a heroic journey, but a victim journey. I had these traumas, they thwarted me, they're continuing to thwart me, and they'll probably thwart me in the present and the future. That's meaning, and it's a journey to feeling enough. Purpose is about the present and future, and it's all about action. So remember, meaning is about the past and it's about thoughts. Purpose is about the present and future, and it's about actions. A lot of people don't have a good sense of enoughness and meaning. And so they go into their work life continually trying to prove their worth. If I make this much money, if I have these many achievements, if I get all these promotions, it'll finally prove I'm enough. And we all know it doesn't work. And they get on this treadmill and they go higher and higher and higher, and they shoot for bigger, bigger, bigger. And purpose gets more big and more audacious. And even if they do accomplish it, they don't feel any better. But if they don't accomplish it, they totally feel like failures. So what happens when these kind of people leave work is they still don't feel enough inside. And so they have to recreate this version of big, audacious goals to prove to themselves that they're enough. But here's the problem. You can't purpose your way to enough. We know this. If you look at pop culture, we have people like Steve Jobs. Remember Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs, one of the smartest guys ever, made tons and tons of money, did some of the coolest things, but he never looked happy. Why didn't he look happy? Probably because he was adopted and he had this version of I'm not good enough and my parents gave me up. And he probably never went back and worked on that story about his childhood. He had a problem of meaning. And so no matter how much he accomplished and no matter how much money he made, it never filled that hole. And so this is what people try to do in retirement. They try to recreate this ability to prove their enoughness. And it's a never-ending treadmill. So it doesn't feel any better than it did when they were in the workplace and fighting and climbing to get higher and higher. If we really want to stop all this over striving and all this running on a treadmill that isn't getting us anywhere, we actually have to go back and maybe do some therapy and start thinking about meaning in our life and realizing that we are always enough and we don't have to prove it. We don't need to use purpose to prove that we're enough. And once you can stop doing that, purpose becomes really abundant and easy. It's just, what can I go do that I enjoy? And go ahead and do it and have it light you up and connect you to other people. It's that easy. It's that simple. But it's something that's really difficult. It's hard to go back and look at your past and work through those traumas and tell yourself a new and better story in which you were a hero. And that's where people get stuck. And that's why it's the same problem whether you're working or you're not working.
No, I love that. That's so important. One, I'm going to be vulnerable here and put a bit of thought work that I've done. And I've presented this to other advisors before, both sides of the pond actually, but I've never really talked about this to someone that I think might tear this piece of thought apart, right? So let's go for it and see, but you don't have to agree with me and I know you won't. But I call it the challenge of who. And I've kind of taken the work by Simon Sinek and gone, right, he talks about why, but who am I to say that he's wrong? But I kind of think he's a bit wrong because I think it actually starts with who. And I think it's kind of coming into what you're saying. So what I try and do when I work with people, I kind of say that this is three-pronged. You need to figure out who you were. You need to figure out who you are today. And you need to figure out who you want to be. And that's a real challenge when we look at this stuff. So I quite like framing this in the terms of who to them. I think that, to human beings going, well, actually, who are you? Who do you want to be? Who have you been? What do you like and dislike about that? And that starts to bring the real good conversations out when I talk to them about this. Is that, I mean, you're nodding, which is wonderful, so I might not get torn apart, but is that...
No, you're not going to get torn apart at all. I mean, when you say who and we're talking about ourselves, what we're really talking about is identity.
Yeah.
And here's a mistake I think people really make, and it gets to little p purpose and big P purpose. The mistake is we think we identify ourselves by accomplishments.
Yeah.
So I will call myself a writer when I've published a book. But the truth of the matter is, I'm a writer when I start writing. It's all about the action. I call myself a runner when I've run a marathon. No, that's not true at all. I call myself a runner when I've bought running shoes. No, that's not true at all. I'm a runner when I run. So identity is based not on goals, but on actions. And I would argue and submit to you, your identity is based on these little p purpose type actions which fill you up and excite you and bring you alive. And so again, I agree, it's on the who, and we're talking all about identity, but we define ourselves by what we do, not what we accomplish. And I think that's what ties this all in. And so I think we have to consider what brings us to a state of flow. What are those actions that help identify who we want to be in this world, and take those actions and stop worrying about whether we hit some pre-specified goal or not.
So I've got 2 points, and one of my recent sketches come about from a conversation I had with a client. And I think a lot of people view retirement as a destination. It's like a thing, right? And actually what this is just part of life's journey, right? It's part of the journey. And I think, as you said, the more that we treat retirement as this destination, it becomes, retirement in itself is a big P purpose, right? It's kind of like, and now I'm there. And we know, having researched the human psyche a lot, that humans are wired for the journey, not necessarily the destination. This enough versus more scenario. You ask anybody about money, it's kind of like, how much is enough? Typically they say double what they've got, right? I mean, it doesn't matter across all wealth levels. So, and also goals are somewhat underwhelming for most people, right? It's kind of like, well, actually they're good during the journey, and I get there, the thought of the process, that you go through, and you get there and it's like, well, I'm here, what next? And so one of my things around trying to create, I believe, these little P purposes is around not understanding that these are destinations, that these are parts of journey,
it's
right?
Process and not goals. And let me tell you, I think retirement is actually fairly artificial. Like, am I retired? I don't know. I mean, I kind of don't practice medicine as much anymore, but there's this one thing that was really purposeful, so I kept doing it. So of course I get paid for that. Then I went into these joyful things that I do now that are very much little P purpose for me, but some make some money, some don't. Am I retired? Am I not? Here's the thing. If you're doing it right throughout your life, you're continuously adding in little P purpose to your life and continuously getting rid of things you loathe. And the truth of the matter is, if you're kind of working your schedule for your whole life, trying to improve the calculus, trying to do more you love and less you loathe, you're going to be slowly subtracting things out that don't work and adding things that do. Some of those things you're going to get paid for, others you won't. But I think if you start living this life, you'll find that retirement actually becomes somewhat of a fuzzy concept. Because if you love doing something and you happen to get paid for it, great. And if you don't get paid for it, but you're financially independent, or you're somewhere in between and can pull back on work, great. And if you're 80 years old and you love doctoring and that lights you up, and every day you go to the office and you see patients and you love it, you're never going to retire, because that's your little P purpose. You just love it and you love the process of doing it. Yes, I understand we need to make money. And yes, I understand there's a point where you can look at your savings and investments and say, okay, I have enough money here that if I stopped making money, I'd be fine. So we define maybe retirement, or at least the option of retirement happens when you get to that point. But most likely, it's not going to be nearly as clear. The more little P purpose you bring into your life, the more likelihood is that actually retirement is going to be a very fuzzy concept, because you're probably going to do some things that make you money and some that don't. But the key is you're going to really like doing most of those things. That's little P purpose. And as we get older, we want more and more of that to be taking up our valuable time, because time passes no matter what you do. The only thing you can control is what activities you're engaged in as time passes. And so we want most of that to be stuff that lights us up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, part of my journey around this podcast was exactly that. I mean, I think retirement is a flawed concept. It was man-made. Yeah. It was invented because basically people died at work. So they kind of had to give people, in the industrial age, it was, retirement really is only about 100 years old. And actually a modern day retirement, the one that we will go through, is very different to the one our parents and grandparents went through. And that I think is fuzzy now, right? And this is what the human brain and the human psyche and everything is battling and bashing up against, this thing that's been fed down, as you said, these pictures from the financial industry are kind of giving us these walking along a beach having wonderful times. It's like, well, it's butting up against this. I mean, I've written before about why I think work should form part of everyone's retirement plan, right? If you love what you do, it's like,
and even if you're doing the dishes, it's work. Like, there are people who do dishes for a living, right? They work in restaurants and they do dishes. And what happens when they have enough money and they retire? Most likely they go home and do their own dishes. Yeah. You're still doing work, but it's a difference. You're kind of doing work for yourself versus doing work for a paycheck. But imagine that even after you retire, you're going to do things, and those things are a version of work.
Yeah. And you rightly said, and I've said this before, this is about, I think, a period of getting rid of the stuff that doesn't light you up and doing everything that does light you up, right? And that's that financial independence thing. That's doing more of the things you love and less of the things you don't. That takes some intentionality to do it. I also think the definition for me is when time becomes more important than money. If when your time becomes more important than money and you've started doing a lot more of the things that you love, you can call it whatever you like, right? But that's kind of that's where you should get to.
What I try to convince people is your time is always more important than your money, because you can always make money and you can never make time.
Yeah. Let's stay on that, because I think, again, I've written about that. I think human beings, and your work in palliative care and end-of-life care, I think will kind of bring this to life. Human beings have a pretty rubbish concept of time. I think we take it for granted. We don't use it very wisely. We waste it. I mean, let's talk about that for a second, because I know you've got some views on that. I mean, I'm full transparency here. I'm working hard on that at the moment. And the more I speak to, the more I see. I think we use time very, very badly until maybe we get to a point when we realize that we should have used it better.
Here's the problem. We have zero control over time. And time, it's funny because, again, we use all these words like how we use, spend, or waste time. It assumes you can commoditize time, and you can't. Time is just a constant, and it passes, and we have zero control over it. So we have no agency over time. There's two things. I actually say there's one, but actually there are two. So I say the one thing we can control is the activities we're engaged in as time passes. There's also time perception, right? So we can control time perception a little bit. For instance, if I say get on the ground and start doing a plank maneuver, if you know what planking is, and I say do it for 10 minutes, that's going to be the longest 10 minutes of your life. And so there are some things about time perception we can play with, but ideally, what we can really do is try to have better control over what fills our time. And so that's that calculus. That's what I really want to wake people up and shake them and say, hey, look, your time is set. We don't know how long it's going to be, how many years. You're born one day, you die another. Yes, you can exercise and wear your seatbelt and do some things to help that be a little bit longer, but it is set and you have no control over it. So all you can do is take these time slots, these days, months, and years, and improve how many of them are filled with little p purpose and get rid of as many of them that are filled with things you loathe. And that takes work. That is a lifelong process of incrementally building in little p purpose into your life, and then incrementally subtracting out things you don't like. The problem is most people don't even think about it until they're getting close to retirement. If we started doing this at 20 and 25 and 30, we would find that calculus is a lot better earlier. And that's the closest we get to really valuing time, this thing we have no control over.
Love to get your thoughts on this. And again, this is observations in real life stuff. Do you see people that get this, I mean, whether it's a right or wrong thing, but they do this better than others, the small p purpose better than others? Do you see that actually that they realize that happiness is a much smaller life than what they thought it would be, and enough is much smaller than what it is? It's, because the groundwork's been done, and because everyone talks about small life, big life, and whatever. Is it smaller than, both on life and enough, if you do the great work and you come to the right conclusions around your purpose?
So it's interesting. I think we all know people like this. I mean, I'm looking back and I had two teachers in high school that lit up all the students. We had the greatest conversations. They had the most passion. They weren't changing the world, right? They were educating young minds, but they weren't curing cancer. They weren't doing all these big things. On the other hand, they produced thousands of students like me who are inquisitive, who wanted to have the tough conversations, and then would go out in the world and produce and add and create. So it's funny because we say small, but it isn't small. I like little p purpose because what we're talking about here is process-oriented purpose. But the impact is anything but little or small. The impact and the legacy from doing these things can be large. So I can think of hundreds of people in my life who were doing this little p purpose and weren't even thinking about it. They were my teachers. There's this guy on the internet. My wife likes purses, so she buys purses on eBay, and one of the kind of purses she likes are Coach purses. But here's the problem. There's lots of fakes and knockoffs. So there's this guy who used to work for Coach, and if you send him the pictures of the purse, he'll look for the serial numbers, etc., and for free, he will authenticate it online so you can buy it on eBay. This guy's retired. He doesn't work for Coach anymore. He does it because he loves it, because he feels connected to this brand. There are countless people in your life, in my life like this. We just don't recognize it as little p purpose. These are the people who are living out their passions, their excitement. And let me tell you, I've seen lots of these people on their deathbeds, and they tend to die very peaceful deaths because they don't have the regrets. Yeah. They look back at their life and they said, I did these things that lit me up. It connected to me to other people. I helped those people and they feel at peace.
Yeah. I suppose the connection that I want to make between all of this is that, when I start working with couples and clients and we go through this stuff with them, and there's an intentional load of work that we do up front before we get into the numbers around their retirement. And we go through this and we try and identify, and I don't call them small p purposes, but we identify similar kind of real foundational level kind of whys and values and aspirations and challenges. And we go, and what they want to do. And I try and break that down even further. So get down to the real kind of what's sitting in your heart and what lights you up. One of the real common reactions that I get, and one of the common outcomes to the numbers, is that they didn't need as much as what they thought, and they could have retired about 10 years or 5 years earlier, right? And that, I suppose that's my connection, is that if this work is, as you were saying, this work is done earlier, I think this real kind of, I suppose, issue around maybe saving enough for retirement and, when they're going to, that all kind of goes away a little bit, I think, because as I say, I think it's smaller in general. The amount of money needed is less. The life that you want to lead, actually, when you get down to the real nitty gritty of what you want to do, is probably less than what you think. I mean, I've used this example before on the podcast, but one of my favorite stories is a really, really high net worth client, high flyer, hated work at the end and all that stuff. And we worked on and he went retired. And I spoke to him 6 months afterwards, and he said, you know what I love the most? Sunday afternoons with my wife and the dog, walking to the pub and having a lunch. Like, that is the thing that lights me up. He thought it was going to be these big grandeur, these massive things. And if that was all that it happened, he could have retired 10 years ago, right? If that's kind of what he wanted to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So money is a mirage. And so if you make that your purpose and your goal, it's like you're climbing a mountain and you see the top of the mountain and you finally get there and realize it wasn't the top at all. It was just a peak. And that way in front of you, there's another huge mountain. It's a false ending. It's a false landing point. And the reason why is there's no why there. Like, I ask people, I'm like, how much money do you need? And they'll say 1 million. And I'll say, why? And they'll be like, so I can leave my job. And why do you want to leave your job? So I can do what I want to do. So what do you want to do? And eventually, when you really push people, it comes out as some version of little p purpose. I want to run the marathon. I want to spend more time with people. I want to do this. I want to do that. And then the big question becomes, well, why can't you do that now? What does that have to do with $1 million or $2 million? Or why can't you start building that into your life now? When you start flipping that script and start identifying what your true purpose anchors are, those are the inklings and the beckonings of things that are important to you. And then you realize that instead of passively waiting for it, you actually have to build a life of purpose around those things. You realize that money is only one tool in your toolkit, but you've also got your passions, your time, your energy, your relationships, your community, your skills. You've got tons of other tools. And while you're waiting for that money to accrue, why not use some of those other tools to start building a life of purpose now? Why wait until that one day? Because God knows you could be like my father, who unfortunately keeled over at 40 years old. He wasn't expecting that. It just happened. Why wait when you actually have most of the tools you need now?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree. Jordan, as we wrap up this, there's two things I want to touch on with you. I very hurriedly read your latest brilliant blog before it kind of dropped in my inbox about 10 minutes before we were meant to hit record today. So I was like, I've got to read this. And links to that. It's on Substack, right? So links to that will be on there. But I just want to touch on a couple of bits in that blog. And the blog's entitled Beyond Money, Why Purpose Moves the Needle More Than Wealth. We'll get back to that bit. But there's a particular sentence in there that I think speaks to everybody, financial planners and people approaching retirement. And that sentence is, the additional spending enabled by a higher withdrawal rate isn't likely to make you happier. And it just hit me because I think there's so much focus on people to go, if I do this and I do that, that means I can take 6.2% instead of 5.8%. And it's like, well, you know, is the extra £2,000 or dollars a month going to really move the needle for you? No. And there's so much focus going, well, give me, how much can I sustainably, the maximum amount I could sustain? Well, that doesn't matter if you don't know what to do with it, right? I mean, it's just really, really hit me like a ton of bricks.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the point that not having enough money can certainly affect your happiness. But once you hit a certain point, having more money doesn't really move the needle as much. It's the expected utility value of money. And we intuitively know this, right? If you have a net worth of $100 million, having one more extra million doesn't really move the needle. But if you have a net worth of $100,000, having an extra million totally moves the needle. And so when you get to that point where you're kind of at enough and you're like, well, if I go from a safe withdrawal rate of 4% to 5%, I can take an extra better vacation, or maybe I can do an extra vacation a year. It just doesn't increase your happiness as much. And it gets back to this idea that money is a great tool to help you live a life of little p purpose, but it's little p purpose that moves the needle. And so we really want to focus on that. And so getting into these huge debates about what the right asset allocation is so that you can have a slightly higher safe withdrawal rate, I think really misses the point.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. So last thing, and I often say to clients that I feel like I'm in the regret minimization business a lot, right? That's kind of what I really want to do. And I know that you have seen people at the point of their life that they can talk about regrets that they have or have not had. I don't know whether there is any of these, but can you share any kind of common regrets that people have, and what lessons can we draw on, you know, one or two of those common regrets?
So here's the thing. We're all unique individuals, just like our version of little p purpose is unique, which means we regret different things depending on our life. But the commonality is that a lot of people at the end say, I really regret that I never had the energy, courage, or time to. And then you've got to fill in the blank, and everyone fills in a slightly different blank. But the point is, I really regret that I never did those things that were deeply important to me. And so for different people, it's going to be a different thing. It might be writing that book. It might be pursuing that hobby. It might be climbing that mountain. Everyone is slightly different. But what this really teaches us is if you can have what's called memento mori, this idea that we're always dying, or this idea that death is always with us while we're living. You can have this idea of memento mori and ask yourself the question, if I found out I was going to die tomorrow, what would I really regret not doing? And turn that into a purpose anchor when you're young and healthy, and start building a life of purpose around those things you know you might regret. That's winning the game. That's what the dying have to teach us.
And it's interesting, Lee, that you've used the word trying. It's not regretment of achievement. It's trying. You mentioned the story about the guy climbing the mountain, right, who didn't actually get to the top of the mountain. He just done it. And that's the story that he tells. It's the regret of not trying, not the regret of not achieving.
It's the old Teddy Roosevelt speech, the arena. You want to be in the arena, fighting the valiant fight, even if you're getting knocked down, even if you're bloodied, even if you can barely lift your head. That's where life occurs. It's when you're in the arena doing things that are deeply important to you. Honestly, success doesn't even matter. It's the valiant fight. And we want to build our life in what I call climbs, but what those are is these valiant fights in which we're doing activities that light us up, that are deeply important to us. But it doesn't even matter if you succeed. It doesn't matter if you reach the goal. The goal is somewhat superfluous. It's the valiant fight. And that's what I want people to feel, that there's total abundance. Because there's a million of those valiant fights. There are a million of those climbs out there. There's a million versions of little p purpose. But we've got to work. We've got to take action and grab them.
Jordan, that's an amazing place, I think, to leave this conversation. I think I could go on for another hour, but that's taken up too much of your time. Thank you so much for this. Your expertise, wisdom, knowledge, and everything is just so amazing. And I know that listeners will get so much value out of this. I can't wait to get the book out into the world. Even though I've read the PDF copy that you were very kindly sent, I'm buying the paperback because, unlike some people, I like to write over books. Everyone kind of has a go at me. It's like, you can't do that on a book. I'm like, no, I like to underline stuff. And all that links will be in the show notes when that's launched. So thank you so much for joining me. And I cannot wait to see the book out and get everyone reading it.
Thank you so much for having me in this great conversation.
And that just leaves me to thank everyone once again for joining me on the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Until next time, take care.